ANA eLearning Academy is brought to you by CDN Graysheet, a trusted source of rare coin and currency valuations since 1963.
Hello everyone, welcome to the ANA eLearning Academy. The ANA would like to thank our sponsor Graysheet for their support of the eLearning Academy. Today we have our museum curator Doug Mudd, who will be presenting on coins of the 300, the numismatics of the Persian Wars. If you have any questions during this presentation, you will be muted, so please put them in either the chat or the Q&A, and I will read them to Doug at the end of his presentation. And without further ado, here's Doug.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearning Academy, and I hope you enjoy this talk. It's based on the idea that a few years ago when the 300 movie came out, I was having a discussion with somebody, and we talked about it, and it turns out there's not a whole lot of information about the coinage that was circulating around the time of the Persian Wars, which basically started in 490 BC and ended around, ended much later than 480 BC, but the major battles in Greece ended with the Battle of Plataea in 480 BC, or 479 BC actually. So this is intended to basically give people an idea of what kinds of coins were circulating along the route of the Persian march into Greece and give a basic history of the wars using the coins to illustrate it. So with that said, let's move on to the first slide. Now, so this will take the form of a numismatic tour, and the tour will begin in Sardis in what is today Turkey, what was at that time the Lydian kingdom, which had been conquered by the Persians about 50 years before. So the tour will continue along the shores of Asia Minor to the Dardanelles and through Thrace, Macedonia, Thessaly, and into Attica, where Athens is located. So you can see the route on the map. It gives you an idea of where some of the battles were and all that. So the earliest coins were made from electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. They were most likely introduced by merchants. Soon afterwards, the kings of Lydia began to issue coins, beginning the long tradition of government-issued coinage that continues to this day. King Croesus of Lydia is credited with creating the first bimetallic coinage of gold and silver in the mid-6th century BC. So the first coin we saw is an electrum stator issued by Phanes. Phanes, we have to assume, was a merchant. We have no records of Phanes being a king or leader of any of the cities in the region. So he was the first to issue coins with a legend on them. And basically the legend says, Phanes made me or issued me. So you see these coins of Croesus. There's the gold 1/3 stator of Croesus that was issued between 561 and 546 BC. This features the emblem of the house of the Lydian kings. So you've got the lion on the left and the bull on the right facing each other. This was a symbol that would be used for approximately 60, 80 years and then continue on off and on depending on the different dynasties and cities within the region. And then you have a silver stator of Croesus with the same design. Now, we have the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was not primarily a monetized empire, but when they conquered the Lydians, they began to issue coins of their own, roughly based originally on the Lydian coinage, but then they changed the designs to reflect the Persian ideals. Basically, the great king in his various poses with different weapons. So you have the great king on this Gold Derrick running forward or perhaps kneeling and firing a bow. On the Siglos, you have a similar design, though there were differences. In this case, he was probably carrying the bow and a possibility of a couple of other things that appear on other coins of the time. Now, Cyrus the Great founded the Persian Empire in 549 BC with the conquest of Media, which had had an empire for about 50 years before that time. He soon expanded his empire to include Lydia by 546 BC and Babylonia by 539 BC. Cyrus died in battle in 530 BC and was succeeded by his son Cambyses, who conquered Egypt, but then was killed in a revolt in 522. Soon afterwards, he was succeeded by Darius I the Great, where the story of the Persian Wars begin. The Persians initially had little use for coinage, and after conquering Lydia, though, as I said, they continued the use of coinage within those areas as a way to simplify the administration of these places that were used to using coinage. Now, here we'll talk about the Greek city-states. When Cyrus the Great conquered Lydia, he also began the conquest of the Greek cities of coastal Asia Minor. At this time, each Greek city was politically independent from each other. More rural areas were loosely organized into tribal units. What made them Greek was their shared language, religion, and culture. The political fragmentation of the Greek cities made them vulnerable to powerful kingdoms and empires such as the Persians and the Lydians before them. By the late 6th century BC, Greeks had settled widely across much of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea coastlines from Spain to North Africa, Sicily, and into the coastline of southern Russia. So Greece, as we think of it at this time, was less of a geographic entity as it is today than it was a cultural, linguistic, social region centered on Greece, where the original settlers had come from, but not limited to Greece. By this time, there are something like 400 or 500 cities already that were founded all over the place around the Mediterranean. So it was a widely spaced area, each of them independent, but each of them sharing certain characteristics, including a love of coinage, because they adopted coinage very quickly after the original invention of them in Lydia. The Greeks began striking their own coins as early as the 550s BC, and by the time of the Persian Wars, most Greek cities issued their own coinage if they were of any size and had any significant trade, international trade. So here you see some of the earliest. Here you have a silver stator of Aegena. Now, Aegena was one of the first Greek states to adopt coinage. It's often considered to be the first, and they had already been famous during the 6th century BC for their navy and their maritime connections. So they chose a sea turtle as a symbol of their trade and all that. But by the time of the turn of the 500s to the 400s, the Aegena was starting to fall behind. They were on a very small island, and unfortunately for them, they were too close to Athens, which was expanding throughout that period. The silver dram of Tanagra and Boeotia. Now Boeotia was a region where the cities, though they fought between each other quite a bit, it was a very rich agricultural area and supported several cities. The city that we're most familiar with historically is Thebes, but these cities were closely related enough where they used a lot of the same designs. So in this case, this design of a shield, an archaic type shield, which the Boeotians were famous for, was also used on the coins the coins of the different cities within the regions, including Thebes, for many centuries. Then we have a silver stater of Corinth. Now, Corinth was a major trade center and was a major colonizer as well. It was responsible for colonizing much of the West. In Italy and in Sicily, many of the major cities had their original foundation in Corinth, including all the way to places like Massalia and things like that. So their coinage always featured a Pegasus on one side, and after this period, the mill sail punch design was replaced by a head of Athena, which Athena was also a patron goddess of Corinth. And then you have the silver Tetradram of Athens. And Athens, as you can guess by the name, was had Athena as their patron goddess, and they featured the head of Athena on one side, and on the other side, the owl, which was the avatar of Athena, and continues to be famous today because it's associated with wisdom, because Athena was the goddess of wisdom and the military arts. An interesting connection with today because of an ancient religious belief. Now we'll go on to one of the causes of the Persian Wars, the Ionian Revolt. In 499 BC, the Greek tyrant of Miletus, which is in Asia Minor and one of the major cities there, a Greek city, Aristagoras, who had been put in power by the Persians, started a revolt against his masters because he feared that he would be replaced due to the failure of an expedition to the island of Naxos, which he had recommended. He was soon able to convince several other Ionian Greek cities to join him and widen the revolt. Other cities in Caria and Mysia, also along the coast of Asia Minor, soon joined it as well, encompassing nearly the whole of Western Asia Minor. Now, this is all very fine. It was an internal situation from the Persian point of view, because all of these cities had submitted at some point within a few years of this to the Persians. Well, the problem was Greeks in the mainland, particularly Athens, were very interested in helping the Ionian Greeks to recover their freedom. Here's a sample of the coinage that existed in these areas. Here's an electrum stater of Clazomenae. Now, one of the things that occurred in Asia Minor among the Greek cities was that since electrum was naturally occurring in Asia Minor, some of the cities continued to issue staters and the fractions of staters for many years, even more than a century after most of the Greek city-states had begun issuing exclusively silver and gold, perhaps in an emergency, but normally only in an emergency. So it's interesting that that region is where you can find some beautiful but very small coins with interesting designs made of electrum. So here you have the prototype of the flying pig, a winged boar on this electrum stater. Then we have a double siglos of Mylasa. Now the siglos is a Persian denomination. It's the silver standard, what we would call a stater if it was using the Greek stater of the region. So they have a coin that's based on a Persian weight system, and it was issued about 500 BC. It was one of the cities that joined the revolt around 500 BC, well, 498 actually. Electrum stater from an uncertain city. Here's another example of one of those cities that issued coins for a while that followed the old electrum metal design. It's an alloy of silver and gold, and created a very beautiful coin. Now this is a coin that's about the size of a dime, a little less than a dime, but much thicker. So you can see the design is very intricate. Perhaps Mercury with the winged, the Greek version of Mercury, sorry, I'm using the Roman version here. with a winged cap. And then we have an electrostator of Kyzikos with what appears to be a bull-headed individual with wings as well and carrying a fish. The fish was representative of many of these cities because they depended on the wealth of the fisheries along the coast, and that was a major portion of their trade. Now we have the Athenian Intervention, which I alluded to. Aristogoras went to mainland Greece to seek help. After being refused by the Spartans, the most powerful Greek city-state at the time, he went on to Athens, which was not quite as prominent as it would be in later years, but still it was one of the top 3 or 4 city-states in Greece. And given the size of its army, it was second to the Spartans. The Athenians, along with the Eretrians, who were also Ionians, Eretria was on an island on the east coast of Greece, off the east coast of Greece. They were also Ionians. They decided to send help in the form of 25 triremes in 499 BC. Now, one of the things that you have to understand with the Greeks is that they were divided into 3 major tribes. You had the Dorians, the Ionians, and the excuse me, I'll have to leave it at that. I don't remember offhand, and I didn't write it down. In 498 BC, the Ionian Greeks, with their Athenian and Eretrian allies, captured and burned Sardis, the capital of Lydia and the center of Persian power in Asia Minor. Soon afterwards, all of the Greeks in Asia Minor and Cyprus were in revolt against the Persians. The Athenians, however, lost interest after their forces were defeated. They decided to return home in 496 BC, and by 493 BC, the Persians, under their king Darius I, had restored control over the rebellious Greek cities and their allies in Asia Minor. The image here is interesting because the trireme, or the typical warship of the time, was an extremely important part of the wars and helped determine the outcome of the initial 2 invasions of Greece. These were large wooden ships that were rowed, and they were a lot like the modern rowing sculls that you see, the racing sculls that you see, in that they were built for speed. These were not heavy-duty ships meant to stay at sea during storms and all that. They typically, every night you had to take them into shore because they were completely packed with oarsmen. They had 3 banks of oars, as you can see in the drawing, and you would have 170 oarsmen arranged in these 3 banks, 10 sailors, and 10 to maybe at the maximum of 30 hoplites or infantry to defend the ships. That meant that these were very crowded, and there was very little room for extra stores such as food or any accommodations at all for the crew. So they almost always put to shore every night and stayed safe. So the first act of the Persian Wars was the Battle of Marathon. In 490 BC, Darius the Great sent an army by sea to punish specifically the Athenians for their involvement in the war. Unfortunately for the Greeks, Athens had gotten the attention of Darius, who wanted to punish the Athenians for the role they had played in the Ionian revolt. Excuse me. And the destruction of Sardis. It is said that Darius had not even heard of Athens before the burning of the city, but afterwards he swore vengeance and had a servant remind him 3 times a day of his vow to destroy Athens. The Persians launched a punitive expedition against Athens in 490 BC. The expedition was carried to Attica by the Persian navy and landed at Marathon, which was a plain about 23 miles away from Athens, where they were met by the Athenian army under Miltiades, an experienced Athenian general who had previously fought for the Persians as a mercenary. Unlike other Athenians, he knew the Persian army and he knew its tactics. The Battle of Marathon is one of the most important battles in Greek history. Had the Athenians lost, Athens would have been destroyed, and most likely all of Greece would have been conquered, with incalculable results for Western history. For the Athenians, the Battle of Marathon was their greatest achievement. The Athenians began to think of themselves as a center of Greek culture and Greek power. This pride was the foundation on which much of their cultural achievements were later built. The first great dramas were those of Aeschylus. The principal subject of these plays is the celebration of Athenian greatness. The great building projects of the later half of the 5th century were motivated by the desire to display Athenian wealth, greatness, and power. So, with the Battle of Marathon won, the Persians retreated, and Darius passed away in a few years, and his successor, Xerxes, took a few years to get the empire back under control. But 10 years later, in 480 BC, after massive preparation, King Xerxes, son of Darius, led a huge force. In the ancient chronicles, they number them to be at least 1 million men, but historians today figure that it was much closer to about 150,000 men to conquer all of Greece. In the meantime, Themistocles had become the most important political leader of Athens. He realized that it was only a matter of time until the Persians returned, and thus began preparing his city for the coming showdown. His most important accomplishment was to convince the Athenians to use the newly discovered silver from Mount Laurion in Athenian territory to finance a huge expansion of the Athenian navy to 200 triremes in order to counter the Persian naval power. It turned out this was a very good idea and a great use for these new silver veins. Mount Laurion had been known for its silver previous to this, but when they found newly untapped silver, there was a major discussion in Athens whether they should just divide the silver revenue among all the citizens, or, as Themistocles suggested, they use that silver to enhance their defenses, and the best way to enhance their defenses was to build a new navy. Here you have a picture of a Persian standard cavalryman. The Persians highly valued their cavalry, whereas as in the previous slide, you see an example of Athenian hoplite, which was the standard infantry and the most famous type of warrior that the Greeks had, versus the famous warriors of the Persians, which were cavalrymen. The only infantry they had that could compare at all to the Greek infantry were the immortals, who were armed with a shield and spear, as were the Greeks, but they were not armored in metal or in bronze as the Greek soldiers were, so they were not quite as well defended, nor were they as well disciplined. And here's a modern reconstruction of an ancient trireme. It's called the Olympias. In 1985, 86, 87, it was used when it was built. It was built in 86, I think. And for the next 3 years, it was used in trials trying to answer questions about how Greek triremes worked. And it is currently in a museum in Athens, where I'd love to go see it at some point. I used to row crew in high school and college, so I would have loved to go and row on that thing. So next, Persia comes back for more. The Athenian fleet was to be critical in helping to prevent the huge Persian army from advancing across Greece, since it had to have support from the sea in order to get enough food. At the start of the invasion, the Persian fleet was made up of over 1,200 triremes. It was recruited from all of the Persian subjects along the shores of the Mediterranean. Greeks, Phoenicians, and Egyptians made up the largest contingent, since they were the most noteworthy for their maritime skills. And so here you see the map of how they progressed as they went from Asia Minor across a bridge that Xerxes built out of boats across the Dardanelles, and then moved along northern Greece, where Thrace and Macedonia in particular submitted immediately to the to the Persians, as they saw no good outcome for themselves if they tried to resist. And it wasn't until the Persian army got to the pass at Thermopylae, which is a pass in Thessaly, northern Greece, along the coast. Basically, it has on one side a high cliff, and on the other side, it has the ocean. So this pass, which narrows down to about 100 yards at its narrowest, was where the Greeks first decided to stand against the Persians. Now we'll pause to talk about the coinage along the way. So as he proceeded to the west, Xerxes and his army passed through areas where coinage was in common use. Now, as troops were drawn from all over the empire, many of these troops would have brought money with them as well. And so this is an example of some of the money that you might have seen within the Persian camp. First off, you have the Gold Derrick. Now, the Derrick was named after Darius, who basically introduced it, but it was the denomination. So it's essentially like a dollar. And the design that was being used at this time, which would change a little bit over time, is the image of the great king either kneeling or running while firing a bow and wearing a crown and the standard Persian robe, basically. Then one of the spectacular examples of archaic Greek coinage, this coin of Fasos, which is an island off of Thrace in the Aegean, it shows basically a satyr with a captured female, and this design was featured on coins from that region for about 150 years. This is an early example, and it's a diobal. Then you have the city of Abdera, which was one of the Greek foundations in Thrace. The Thracians were a separate people from the Greeks, and the Greek cities that were settled in the region around 700 BC were more or less under constant surveillance by the Thracians. They would often conduct raids against the cities. Well, at times, certain tribes would also be closely allied with other cities. So it was a bit of a precarious existence, and the fact that these cities had walls and good defenses were what allowed them to exist in the region. But most of them went straight over to the Persians because of they had no hope of standing up on their own without support from the rest of Greece. So here's an example of a coin from that period in the region. It's a winged griffon. Now, Macedonia, which was not a unified kingdom at this point, it had different tribes, with some tribes having urban centers and being slightly more important. But the Macedonian kingdom itself was fairly small and not nearly as powerful as it would become later by the end of that century. So the tribes and cities of Thrace and Macedonia along the Persian route submitted to Darius 10 years before and continued their allegiance without necessarily having had any occupation by Persians to the time of Xerxes when he marched through with his army. So here you have a different type of coinage. These are on Greek standards and include some of the largest of the Greek coins. The Thraco-Macedonian tribes, among them the Darones, were famous for having issued the silver dodecadram. Now this is a 12-dram coin, so it's larger than the later decadrams. So it's a big, hefty coin, larger than a quarter, not quite as large as a $50 in size, but much thicker. And here you have a bull pulling a chariot and a figure driving the chariot and a war helmet, a Corinthian type helmet above. And you have the inscription Daron for the Daronis tribe. Next to it, you have a silver tetradram from Acanthos. Now, this is more of a standard size you expect for the large denomination Greek coins. And it's got an image which would continue for many decades with variations where you have a bull attacking a lion attacking a bull, sorry. And this is a famous design of coinage that was fairly common for the area. And then in Macedonia, what would be the ancient capital of Macedonia, Ege, you have a silver stator featuring a goat looking backwards and a symbol above, which would be carried on in the Kingdom of Macedonia as a shield symbol and as symbols on palaces and things of that sort. Now we'll go to the Battle of Thermopylae, which I described generally earlier. Some of the Greek cities that opposed Xerxes, which was a small minority of the totality of the cities in Greece at the time, led by Sparta, decided to try to stop the Persians at the Pass of Thermopylae in northern central Greece. This location was ideal because it consisted of a narrow corridor between the mountains and the sea that could be defended indefinitely by a few thousand men, and it was directly opposite to the narrow channel between the island of Euboea and the Greek mainland, where the Persian fleet could similarly be stopped by the smaller Greek fleet. So this was a choke point for getting into central and southern Greece, and naturally it multiplied the power of the smaller navy and army of the Greeks. So they decided that this would be a good place to hold off the enemy. Another advantage was that if they couldn't defeat them, they could at least hold them off long enough to give the cities of southern Greece, central Greece, a chance to build up the forces and prepare for an extra month or so to meet the Persian invasion. And so you can see here, 7,000 hoplites were sent to Thermopylae while the Greek navy was stationed at Artemision. You can see the island of Euboea, and you can see Athens below. You can see the track of the Persians as they went in. They went around Euboea on both sides after defeating the forces at Thermopylae. And it turns out that the defeat at Thermopylae, which resulted in the famous story of King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 Spartans who died to the last man defending the pass. And they had to do that, unfortunately, because there was a path around the pass in the mountains that was betrayed to the Persians by the citizens of Plataea, a town that was nearby. Actually, not Plataea. It was a town in the region nearby, and they were forever remembered as traitors to Greece. But it resulted in the Persians being able to get on both sides of the pass and trap the Spartans in particular, who volunteered to stay with their king, while the rest of the Greek forces, the other 6,000 or so hoplites, were able to escape. What's little known is that Theban hoplites also chose to stay behind and died with the Spartans as well. Luckily for the Greeks, part of the Persian fleet was wrecked as they tried to go around Euboea on the outside or open ocean side, which helped cut down the numbers a little bit, which helped later on in the campaign. At the Battle of Thermopylae, for a little bit more description here, the small force of 7,000 Greeks led by King Leonidas held up the Persian army for 3 days. They were defeated by Xerxes because of that path I mentioned, and this created an opportunity for Leonidas to make one of the best known last stands in history. And one of the famous things today is that there's a monument that was set up and has been re-erected in the modern period that's attributed to to the Greeks in honor of Leonidas with an inscription: "Stranger, tell them in Lacedaemon," which is the Greek name for Sparta, "that here we lie, obedient to their will." Now, Thermopylae was a defeat for the Greeks, but it showed Xerxes, just as Marathon had shown Darius, that conquering Greece was not going to be easy. Besides bolstering patriotism, the courageous self-sacrifice of Leonidas and his men won the Greeks the time necessary to reorganize and assemble their forces for the decisive battles to come. And here we have some more of the coins that were around at the time. Again, the silver dram of Tanagra with the shield and the mill sail punch design on the reverse, and a Corinthian silver stator exemplify the coinage that you would find in central and the northern part of southern Greece. And here you see the Pegasus on the obverse and the head of Athena on the reverse for the Corinthian stator. And the coins of Corinth retained for most of their existence the use of an archaic letter form that was not used in classical Greece, the kopa, which is the letter that you see there. The way it's normally shown, the right side up would be the circle at the top and the line below it. So it looks very much like a magnifying glass, but that is an archaic letter form that had the sound of our K today. And it's the first letter of Corinth. The next major battle was at Salamis. Salamis was another choke point, basically between the mainland of the Peloponnesian peninsula, where Sparta and Corinth and other famous cities were located, and an island off the coast that formed a narrow place where the Greek fleet, which is still outnumbered despite the Persian losses, to hold them off and stage a battle in which they had a chance of defeating the enemy. Now, the stand at Thermopylae provided the setting for many films, books, and plays. Most recently, as I'd said, this is based on the film 300. The defeat of Leonidas forced the Greek navy to retreat and open up central Greece to the Persians. Themistocles convinced the Athenians to abandon their city except for a few diehards who decided to occupy the Acropolis and retreat to Salamis and other islands nearby. The Persians burned Athens to the ground and destroyed the Acropolis, and then advanced to the Isthmus of Corinth, where the Spartans and the Greeks of the Peloponnesus prepared to make a last stand. Basically, the Greeks of the Peloponnesus built a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, which is approximately 30 miles wide at that point, and decided to stand against the giant Persian army. In the meantime, Athens had made this great sacrifice to allow their city to be captured and burned, because, as Themistocles had told them, it was fruitless to try to defend the city, because more than likely they would be burned down, and then the whole population of Athens would be destroyed. So the Persian advance was halted at the Battle of Salamis, where the Persian fleet was defeated in the narrow straits of Salamis between mainland Greece and the island of Salamis, with Xerxes looking on from nearby heights. So Xerxes was actually seated on his throne from a point where he could see the battle, and yet he wouldn't be part of it. He was too far away. It would have been something like a mile and a half to be able to see it. So this all occurred at his feet and within his sight. The defeat at Salamis convinced Xerxes to call an end to the campaign for the year, and he left his satrap Mardonius in central Greece with part of the original force to finish the job, while he returned to Asia Minor. On this slide, you see some examples of, these are miniature soldiers representing hoplites of the time. So you have them with their various shields. Pegasus and the lion and the Medusa head are common designs found on many Greek shields of the time. And you get the impression of these guys that were heavily armored and had 9-foot spears. These are the men that were depended upon to defeat the Persians at the time. And here we have both sides of an archaic Athenian Tetradram. These are the kinds of coins that would have been used to pay for the fleet. You have the head of Athena at the left, and that's the obverse, and the Athenian owl on the right. So in 479, Mardonius, who had been left behind with a large army, but only a portion of what the total army had been, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Plataea. The remaining Persian fleet was destroyed in the Battle of Mycale, thus ending the invasion of Greece. Plataea was the high point of Greek cooperation. Never had so many hoplites fought together as one army. Over 37,000 hoplites, which are the heavy infantry, which is basically the middle and upper classes of the citizenry of the cities. They had to buy their own armor, and the armor of the time has been compared, the cost of it has been compared to the cost of buying a mid-level car today. It was very expensive, and so only the upper middle class and the upper classes could afford them. These 37,000 heavily armed men were supported by around 70,000 light troops, which means unarmored infantry using bows or javelins or slings to fight. They faced approximately 120,000 Persian troops. After Plataea and Mycale, the Greeks then went on to the offensive. Their allied fleet sailed to the Hellespont, which is the entrance to the Black Sea, where the Athenians and the newly liberated Ionians besieged Sestos, which is a major city there controlling part of the crossing. The resulting boost to Greek morale and confidence in their own prowess as warriors meant that they would end up with the upper hand for the next century or so. But the Persians still remained involved in Greek affairs, not directly militarily, though they spent a lot of money to hire Greek mercenaries particularly after this period, and this is where you get the story of Xenophon and the Anabasis, the march of the 10,000 Greeks across the central area of Asia Minor and back to Greece over the period of a year when they got stranded. So they were able to march across that despite the attempts by the Persians to destroy them. A pretty amazing feat in showing the quality and training of the Greek soldiers. But this allowed the Greeks to maintain their independence, and despite Persian interference in Greek affairs, particularly with the use of money, in which they made sure that the Greeks were, as much as possible, fighting each other instead of fighting the Persians until the time of Alexander the Great. And if you remember, Alexander the Great specifically started his invasion of Persia as an act of revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece more than 150 years before his time. And the aftermath. In 478 BC, the Spartans withdrew from the war. The Athenians then set up a Delian League to continue the fight. The Persians were driven from Thrace, and then, after the Battle of Eurymedon, from Ionia. The war moved to Cyprus and then Egypt, where Egypt revolted against the Persians. Sparta became alarmed over the power of Athens, which controlled the Delian League, and declared war. Athens basically turned the Delian League, which was originally an alliance, into their empire, and they were eventually defeated in Egypt by a Persian force commanded by Megabyzus and Artabazus, and they came to peace with Sparta and signed the Peace of Calais with Persia in 448 BC. With that peace, Cyprus returned to Persia, and Persia was forced out of the Aegean entirely. They were not allowed to have fleets in that area. With the war ended, but the Greeks and the Persians continuing to meddle in each other's affairs, this continued until Persia was invaded and conquered by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great in the period between 332 and 323 BC. In the meantime, Athens became the cultural and intellectual center of the Greek world. Athenian philosophers and artists earned the immortal fame that they have even today as they set the course of Western civilization. The Spartans, however, looked on with increasing dismay as Athenian power grew. It was only a matter of time until the two greatest Greek cities clashed once again. And there you would have the Peloponnesian Wars, which is another story best told by the former Athenian general Thucydides. In this slide, you see some examples of what happened in Greece. The Acropolis was transformed into the amazing place that you can see even today, through its ruins. You had the Temple of Athena and all of the other buildings that are so famous today that were built in the period after the Persian Wars and before the end of the Peloponnesian Wars. In the meantime, the Spartans looked on and gradually, because of their military system and its restrictions, faded away, leaving very little in the form of an artistic legacy. But here's an example of a statue that was actually made in Sparta of a Spartan ephor, one of their leaders, looking very Spartan with his cloak and his typical Corinthian style helmet and a sideways crest showing that he was a leader. And with that, we come to the end of the show. As Loken had said, If you have any questions, please pass them on through chat and she'll share them with me. Let me stop sharing here. And
we don't have any questions yet, but if you do have any for Doug, please put them in the chat or the Q&A and I will read them to Doug.
I hope everybody enjoyed the little stroll across Greek history and the history of the Persian Wars.
This is the second Greek one this week for me.
Ah, okay.
Yesterday I had an Athenian.
Nice. About Athenian coinage then? Very
yeah, cool. Yeah. Someone said, thank you, Doug.
You're welcome. Anything else that people want to ask about or maybe comment on?
So
we're open to anything.
But if you do, please put it in the chat or the Q&A and I can read it to Doug. I'll give it a couple more minutes. And then if not, we'll go ahead and end it.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there, and it is very condensed. Obviously, I didn't show all of the possible coinage, but I wanted to give an overview of what the armies would have seen or been familiar with at the time. It's an interesting set because these are, all very early coins for the time. So it's a little fun. Most people are not as familiar with these as they would be with the coins of just 50 or 100 years later.
We had another comment saying, thank you, we really enjoyed it. If there's no more questions, I'll go ahead and close out. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, we'd like to thank our partner Graysheet for supporting the eLearning Academy. And we hope that you will join us on future eLearning webinars.